Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm a bookseller at Literati Bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're so pleased to welcome Rachel E. Gross in support of Vagina Obscura and in conversation this evening with Ed Yong. Just a quick webinar overview for our attendees. If you're just joining us, the chat is closed, but you can keep the chat window open. I'll be sharing links to purchase Vagina Obscura from Literati throughout the event. The Q&A is available to you, however, to submit any questions that you might have for our author this evening. I'll read a selection of those questions at the conclusion of the conversation. And live transcription is available to you on your toolbar as well using the CC icon. If you're watching us later on YouTube, there are always links to purchase books in the description directly below me. You also find a little typewriter icon right here, and you can click that to subscribe to our channel and stay up to date with all of our At Home with Literati events once they become available on our channel. And as a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeast Michigan or the Ann Arbor area, of course, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. But most of all, we would just like to thank you for your attendance this evening, or this morning, or this afternoon, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us. So without further ado, I'll introduce tonight's author and our moderator. Rachel E. Gross is an award-winning science journalist based in Brooklyn, a former Knight Science Journalism Fellow and digital science editor of Smithsonian Magazine. She writes for BBC Future, The New York Times, and Scientific American. Speaking with her this evening, Ed Yong is a Pulitzer Prize-winning science writer on the staff at The Atlantic, where he also won the George Polk Award for Science Reporting, among other honors. His first book, I Contain Multitudes, was a New York Times bestseller and won numerous awards. His next book, An Immense World, How Animal Senses Reveal the Hidden Realms Around Us, is out in June. You can pre-order that from Literati Bookstore as well. His work has appeared in The New Yorker, National Geographic, Wired, New York Times, Scientific American, and more. He lives in Washington, D.C. Please join me in welcoming Rachel E. Gross and Ed Yong into your living rooms.
Well, thank you so much. I am very, very excited about this. Rachel's book, Vagina Obscura, is an absolute triumph. It's one of the best things I've read in the last year. It's beautiful science writing. It's fascinating. It's urgent. It's important. And I'm really, really excited to be here to hear everything that Rachel has to say about the process of creating it. And Rachel, often I think we start with the origins of books, and I think that's a good place to start here. But it's sort of easy because you actually tell the origin story of the book at the start of the book. What a novel place to put that piece of detail. So can you tell us that origin story? How did Vagina Obscura come about?
Absolutely, and it's my privilege and honor to be here and talking to you, no less. So this is a dream for me, and thanks everyone for joining. So I sort of have two kind of origin stories. The one that's less climactic is that I was an editor at Smithsonian about 5 years ago, where I had the pleasure of publishing an excerpt from I Contain Multitudes. And I was really, really focusing a lot on gender, on reproductive biology, on animal sex, one of my favorite topics. And I was realizing that I'd started this column on like unsung women in the history of science with a wonderful writer, Layla McNeil. And at the same time, I was writing all these stories about how we know very, very little about reproductive organs, about female biology. And I kind of realized there was something going on, like an intersection, that there really was a lack of women and LGBT scientists in the history of science. That was connected to a lack of good science on women's bodies. And it was about who was asking the questions and who was at the table. And the story I start with in the book is a few months after that, I had a vaginal infection and it wouldn't go away. It was very annoying. And I had to keep leaving the office, which involved having a key card, and it was just not great. And eventually my gynecologist said, I'm sorry, like antibiotics aren't working. There's really no good option, but here's a last resort. It's called boric acid, and it's actually rat poison. You're going to see that on the internet, but I'm just going to tell you it now. So I ended up taking this, and as I kind of go into in the intro, where my experience, I think, diverges from other people with this problem, I accidentally swallowed my vagina poison, which was a suppository, and ended up in the ER. And that was the moment where I was really having this out of body experience where I thought that I might die. I had no idea what I had been putting in my body. I had listened to my doctor. I had kind of trusted what she had to say. And even she was telling me, I don't know what's going on here. A third of all adult women get this infection. It's called BV. And yet we don't have a good way to treat it. The ways that we do, it keeps coming back. It affects everything from sexual health to fertility. And we haven't figured out anything for it except this this acid that's been around since the 1800s and is an antiseptic. And I sort of like, I had to like confront my own lack of knowledge and how I really thought of myself as being pretty informed about this part of the body, about myself. And actually I knew like almost nothing. And it seemed like doctors didn't really either. So that kind of led me on this journey to figure out why we know so little and whether that's changing.
And then how did you go from that, like getting the germ of the idea to you know the finished product? And there's so many bits of that to unpack, but I guess I'm curious, like in particular, that the book is structured around many chapters, each of which focus on a different part of the female reproductive systems. You have a chapter on the uterus, the vaginal microbiome, two in the clitoris, which I want to get back to. But like, how did you like, was that clear from the start? Like, how did you decide what goes in the book and what didn't?
Yeah, I'm both like a structure nerd and a sci-fi nerd. And I really think that the first thing that hit me when I started thinking about like for having a book on the science of vaginas was Journey to the Center of the Earth, or 2000 Leagues Under the Sea. And so I was really imagining it being this journey from sort of the outside in this case. And that really made it clear kind of the order of the chapters and how each one would end up being kind of a different organ. Yeah, clitoris, vaginal microbiome. And I wanted to investigate how science originally mapped that organ and what early anatomists got wrong. But it ended up being a lot about the new generation of scientists who are remapping those organs and really reimagining what they're for and what they do and how they contribute to like health as a whole, not just fertility. And so it ended up being that most chapters are also kind of an in-depth profile of a modern historical scientist, usually a woman who has made it their mission to re-envision the organ we're talking about.
Did you know about those people when you started that journey? Was that part of the discovery process of creating the book for you?
I think that was in the proposal process. So I was lucky enough to have this fellowship at MIT for 9 months where I was able to like take classes in reproductive biology and anatomy and feminism. And I was sort of keeping an eye out for what like I always follow kind of eureka alerts and new science. And as a science editor, I was always doing that. And I was trying to think what's new about what we know about these organs, which, you know, we've had forever, but we're still finding new discoveries about something as universal as anatomy. And I would come across these incredibly surprising stories. Like one of them was that there was some scientist in Boston who was finding that actually women may make new eggs throughout their lifetime. And I'd always been taught that like the ovaries degenerate, you're born with all the eggs that you'll ever have. And by the time they finally run out, that's menopause and like it's done. And so seeing that there were biologists who were actually like changing the literature and rethinking that made me really interested, and how angry it made other scientists. Like the really debate flashpoints were really fascinating to me.
Right. Like I had this this very visceral reaction in reading some of these chapters about just how recent some of these discoveries are. You know, in the chapters on the clitoris, you talk about Helen O'Connell's work in actually uncovering just like the basic shape of the organ like just the fundamental anatomy of the clitoris. And she was doing that work in like the 1990s and early 2000s. Like I felt like I had a full-on dissociative experience when I learned that. Right, you know, this is a thing that is part of the bodies of half the people who have ever lived, and we find out its shape in the 2000s. It's crazy, right?
Yeah. I mean, that is one of the craziest examples, is that like anatomy doesn't change. So why does our like understanding of it change so much and have so far to go? And with her, like, you know, I didn't want to hyperbolize. So I did go back to the history books and find out like in the 1800s in Germany, there was an anatomist who had really good illustrations of the clitoris and all the nerves and things. But for some reason, it just never caught on. It never got into the textbooks, and it never really went mainstream. It's like people didn't value or prioritize this knowledge. And I think even more than that, when I talked to Helen O'Connell, she would say, like, I think I'm just using modern tools to kind of surface this understanding that existed. But she was definitely doing more. She was saying, for centuries, people have been envisioning these as these fragmented parts that kind of don't work together, and they separate out the different parts of the clitoris, like the bulbs, for instance. By the way, this is the clitoris. If you haven't read the book yet, it's angled like this. I can get more into that. But these bulbs that are erectile structures that are completely analogous to the erectile tissues in the penis had always been colored a different color in textbooks, and they were just called like the bulbs of the vestibule, which is like a waiting lobby to the vagina. And so it wasn't clear that they're all connected and they share the same nerve and blood supply, and this is all one organ, and it's a lot larger than people think. Like the part you can see and touch is really just this like less than 10% kind of beak. And so
it really does look a bit like a beak, doesn't it? I don't know if you've watched Prehistoric Planet, which is out now, but some of the pterosaurs look remarkably like the model that you've just held up.
I call it like a penguin spaceship thing, but on the cover there's a lot of Easter eggs by the incredible artist Armando Beve, but one is a flying clitoris, and we call it the clitorodactyl. Very much encourage naming creatures after the clitoris.
Right.
But my point was she really like unified this as a superstructure, and for some reason no other anatomist had thought that that was important, and it's incredibly important. Like for instance, when doing any sort of surgery around there, you need to know where all the nerves and blood vessels are, and that this is all part of the sensory structure. You need to avoid it, you need to preserve it, in the way that people work really hard with prostate surgeries to preserve sexual health for men.
Yeah. Can you say more about this big theme that runs through the book about why we know so little about these structures? Because I think like there is the obvious reason of men have been historically terrible, but like I think you do an amazing job of like unpacking that for all the different facets that it contains, and like a lot of the subtleties and nuances to it too.
Yeah, I think I'm fascinated by that too, that there is this kind of easy narrative about men are terrible. And I think there's a slightly different way to look at it. And I think you do it really good in a men's world, that people that people that come from different backgrounds, that have a slightly different perspective, whether it's about their sensory experience of the world or their racial background and their relationship to their body, they are just asking different questions, bringing something different to the table, asking questions that people that have been kind of indoctrinated in the dogma of their field can't ask anymore. So I think one example that's not a woman or LGBT person, actually, there's one white man, John Tilley, and he's the one that comes up with the idea that women may make new eggs throughout their lifetime. And what really struck me, it was him and his research partner, Dory Woods, together, and both of them came from a chicken lab. So most ovarian biologists study humans the whole way through. They go to medical school, they learn human anatomy, and these two had a very different background studying chickens in the Midwest. And chickens actually have the most strange like reproductive system. They have one ovary. It's like bigger than your fist, and it's like a cluster of grapes or tomatoes, basically. And each one is an egg in a different stage of death or growth. And they, pop that out and it becomes an egg. But apparently, chicken scientists already kind of understand that if an ovary is injured, it will grow back. Sometimes an ovary will even grow back as a testy and change like the kind of gender makeup, the sex makeup of the chicken. So they're known to be kind of like regenerative and renewing, and like they can remake themselves. And everyone coming into human ovaries had this assumption that human ovaries are only degenerative. They only waste away, they only lose eggs. And so when they came in realizing that this was part of their normal foundation, it wasn't so strange to them when they saw data that challenged that assumption. They said, like, well, based on our model, this is definitely possible. We should investigate it further. And most other ovarian biologists said that's completely insane and unscientific and like unsupportable. Everyone knows, that was a phrase I got all the time. Like, everyone knows that the sperm penetrates the egg and the sperm is the active component. And you needed people that could see that what everyone knows might still need some critique.
Right. And the book does such a great job of like in many places highlighting that nature of science as a social enterprise, that it's so profoundly influenced by like the what scientists to bring to the table, who gets to be a scientist in the first place. Like, I love this line that you have where you write, you can't see what you aren't looking for, or you see what you expect to see. And in many ways, this book is about different ways of looking. Like in some ways, like the mere existence of vagina obscura just like does sort of expand people's understanding of like this, what everyone knows, right? Like maybe it sets like a different baseline for us to think about all of these structures going forward.
Yeah, I really hope so, because as I was reporting it, I was seeing these assumptions baked into my own understanding. And like, I constantly use words like reproductive organs and the reproductive system. And I too thought of the uterus as like, the cool science thing about the uterus is it makes a baby. And like, that's what these organs are for. And it was one of the most mind-blowing things to find that actually these organs are crucial to your overall health. Like the ovaries, especially, you often think of them as having lots of eggs, but like they're pumping out the hormones that support every body system, like bones, brain health. And that was a paradigm shift for me that I really hope can happen more in the public conversation. And by the way, the uterus, like the mind-blowing thing that I learned about was every month for most women and people with uteruses, the lining is really remaking itself and growing anew, and even growing new blood vessels. And they're called decidual cells because they fall off like the leaves of a deciduous tree. And so through this like elaborate hormonal, like synchronized dance, the body knows to shed all of these cells that have just grown over the period of a few weeks, get rid of them, and then start growing them again with no wound, no scar, like ushering immune cells to the site. It's just, nothing else in the body can do that, or is that regenerative. And yet scientists hadn't been looking at it that way. Like, wow, we could learn a lot about regeneration and woundless, scarless healing.
That's incredible. Right. And you talk about how I think one of the challenges of writing a book like this is that firstly, like there's no real term for, there's no evocative good term for all the things that you're writing about, right? You have female reproductive system, which I think does like double duty in both being like a mouthful and like not very compelling as a term, but also something that, as you said with the uterus, like kind of shoehorns like all this wondrous biology into like make baby as the function, while ignoring like all the other cool stuff. And
oh my gosh,
I assume that was like a huge challenge in like describing it, in working out the scope of the book, in like thinking about it yourself.
Yeah, because language like totally creates like the constraints of our world. And I think that's why initially the idea was like science of vaginas. And like in my head, I knew that I meant pelvic organs, which is even less sexy to say. And then eventually it became like sexual and reproductive organs, but not the breasts. And that was even less helpful. So I like saying like vagina et al. Or vagina and friends and colleagues.
Right.
Sometimes works depending on the context. But I mean, I guess sort of what unites them is they have all been shoehorned in this way and united by the fertility theme. And yeah, it was, I think I go into that in like some sort of disclaimer in the intro about exactly what I'm talking about. And when I talk about women in female bodies, that I don't mean that in a restrictive way at all. I'm talking about people who have this anatomy and people who identify as women and people who like are connected to these types of bodies, which is all of us.
Yeah. And did you, I can only assume that that was a challenging thing to have to navigate, like the fact that you're also writing about trans people, intersex people, and that like just the language that we have around issues of sex and gender feels like not really commensurate to the challenge of actually describing like the sheer variety of the people and the bodies that you're writing about. Was that hard? Like how did you navigate that?
Yeah, I think again, it's weird because I said like language can constrain what we think of, but I feel like this was actually in my head before, and I actually had to end up like accounting for it. So I always knew that there'd be a chapter on gender affirmation surgery. It'd be at the end, which I think is like a very crucial jumping off point. And I knew it was important for many reasons. Like these are like, this is a field that is teaching us about all forms of vulvas and vaginas and the vaginal microbiome, and actually like brings together a lot of what these organs do. And like the people involved, both like the surgeons and the women getting these surgeries, were like so crucial and central to people I was talking to. But I kind of had to explain how that fit in to people when I was structuring the book, talking to publishers and stuff. And so I had to explain it to myself as well. So the other thing was I was writing outside my comfort zone in a lot of ways, which, yeah, you probably relate to it in some ways. Like, I was like, all right, I know I can write about female biology or whatever. I don't have like insight into this particular history of like Black women in gynecology or intersex history or trans history. And so I came to just have a very different relationship with sources than I normally did, where I consulted like historians very extensively and really relied on them and said that they were doing the primary research sometimes. And other times I had like sensitivity readers from within the community, like the intersex community. And it was very humbling to get back their feedback. And the things that they noticed were things I could not pick up on my own, like the phrase enlarged clitoris, that might be offensive or just inaccurate because it suggests there's like it focuses on the process of enlarging rather than just outside the typical variation or like outside what doctors have determined to be typical. So yeah, there was quite a lot of time spent finessing language and getting people's feedback on how it could be construed.
I'm glad you did it. It's such a crucial part of that process, and I feel like you know, that the thoughtfulness with which you approach that really comes through in the book. So you know, sure, it's I felt very confident as a reader, like reading it. You know, it felt like someone had really thought through these issues with immense depth and care. And so, you know, we've talked a little bit about the clitoris, and I wanted to sort of return to it because it's, you know, it's this, after the introduction, it's the start of the book, and it's also I think the only organ that you sort of devote 2 chapters to. So I get, you know, you talked about wanting to start from the outside in, but can you talk about like why that was the beginning of the book? Why 2 chapters? Like, tell me more about the history that you sort of uncovered here.
I love this question. Thank you. Also, we are temporarily renaming this bookstore Literati tonight because I've decided.
Amazing.
Sorry, I had to. Yeah, I really love that I ended up having 2 chapters on the clitoris because I think it's quite well known for being dismissed and overlooked throughout history and medicine. And so surfacing it back to the center is a nice thing. But I think also like structurally, it ended up, it kind of like wrote itself because the first character that I found in the book before I even started writing it was Marie Bonaparte, who I go into. She's the great grandniece of Napoleon, who most people have heard of. She's a noblewoman who becomes a princess of Greece and Denmark. And she also is a woman who really like is a trailblazer in studying women's clitoral anatomy, their experiences in bed with their husbands in most cases. And she actually co-develops a medical procedure to move her own clitoris in order to experience what she thinks is the natural sexual experience. And that is basically what Freud tells her. She becomes his pupil and bestie later on. And he says that a mature, normal woman must experience this thing called the vaginal orgasm, which he basically made up. And so she's just such a fascinating historical figure to me. And she's really obsessed with like her own sexual experience and what is normal. And like she collects so much data on like more than 300 women in their gynecology exams, which no man could do at the time. That was totally impossible culturally. And that data is still being worked with today to look at like the range of variation in the vulva. But she is really thwarted by, like, we talk about science as a social enterprise. And I found that the psychoanalysis and Freud, who I did not expect to be big in this book, ended up being kind of a big shadow over multiple chapters.
Yes, when he shows up in a later chapter, I'm already so primed to loathe Freud by the earlier ones that I audibly groaned when the build up to it is fantastic when he reappears. I was like, oh, this guy.
It's like another thing screwed up in medicine. Guess who's to blame? Freud. And I didn't mean to do it like in a blamey villain way, but like I just kept being directed to him constantly in my research, unfortunately. But I'm not answering your question really. So yeah, so there was just this powerful story around Marie Bonaparte and around someone's real effort to understand what was going on with anatomy and sexuality in the 1900s. And she was frustrated, like in every sense in the word. And like, I just kept reading her story and realizing like, it's because you keep referring to the clitoris as this little nub and just like this thing on the surface. And then I was coming across Helen O'Connell's work that says actually there's this underground kingdom, and this really explains so much of people's experience. This, like, the picture was so small, it needed to zoom out and become complete. And so I really felt like I want to juxtapose Marie Bonaparte's exploration with Helen O'Connell's and how it's affected real women and patients and people's relationship with their doctors and their bodies, that there is a new understanding of this anatomy. So that, yeah, I kind of thought of it as like the first chapter was like the tip of a pyramid, like covered in sand. And then in the second chapter, we went down below to the rest of it.
I think it really works. I think it makes the second chapter feel like more dramatic, the fact that it has this standalone thing. And the first chapter is wonderful and beautifully told, but it's also sort of more what I think I expected going into the book, like to learn about that history and the sort of social forces behind like that lack of knowledge. And then when when the second chapter expands like both like anatomically and like conceptually, it really is like I think the second chapter is when I went from this is a really good book to this is a great book. And like there's a lot there too about I think some of the myths that I think like even people who are listening to this may still be like harboring about like vaginal versus clitoral orgasms, and the existence of the G-spot. Can you do like a quick précis about like some of those concepts?
Yeah, definitely. So this is why I had to go into the Freud stuff, because he really elaborated on and put out this theory in the world that there was an immature, infantile way to have an orgasm, and then there was like a mature way. And by complete coincidence, the mature way was the way that you had babies with, meaning that if you were a good woman, you were probably having babies. So he basically said that a little girl wants to be a boy when she realizes she does not have a penis, and her form of sexual pleasure is clitoral, so only involves that. And at some point, her center of pleasure transfers to her vagina, which later sexologists found was definitely impossible biologically. And so he said that like all women need to make this transference. And if you have problems making this transition, that results in all your psychological issues, which is the stuff that therapists are meant to work on. So you end up being hysterical or having neuroses. And yeah, it's really striking. He didn't base this on any science. Like, he was trained as a neurologist studying like crayfish, and he did not have any research on the female body. But it just became so influential that like I still heard today, I talked to surgeons who do this procedure for women who've had genital cutting, and it's called clitoral restoration, and it kind of tries to bring up, so it again relies on this like expansive anatomy. It brings up some of the sensory tissue to the surface, and even they use these terms like some women are clitoral and some are vaginal. They would say that, and I was like really struck by it, because that's like, again, has no medical basis, and it's still like kind of this, it's like this ghost that hangs over the field, and it didn't even come from a doctor, it came from Freud. And so that's like the old myth, and I think it's still repeated in women's magazines, and like I used to read that kind of stuff in women's magazines. I also used to read stuff about the G-spot, and I think everyone has a different introduction to this concept, but the way that I was reading about it in Cosmo was like, there's this cool, awesome sexual experience that you should be having, and if you can't, like, you're really missing out. And the connection I ended up making in the book was that's basically how people describe the vaginal orgasm in Freud's time, was like, this is a type of sexual experience that you should have, and like you're inadequate if you don't have it. So I ended up going to see Helen O'Connell, and she had been asked this exact question by another journalist, like, what is the G-spot? Has anyone found it anatomically? And no one really had. There was a lot of debate over it. And so she did a lot of microdissection and MRI imaging. And basically what she found was that because we now know that clitoris is such an expansive structure, there's all these different parts of it where different erectile tissues come together. And she calls this the root of the clitoris. So it's where the bulbs and the arms meet. And it encircles the vagina and the urethra. And so there's a spot that is about an inch up on the belly side that people call the G-spot. And it looks like it's probably just this confluence of tissues of the clitoris. And like, yeah, it was like kind of an anticlimactic discovery, no pun intended. But yeah, and it really took, like, I had to look at like a lot of diagrams and 3D images to understand this, that like the urethra and the vagina go through here, and you'd just be like, you'd be pressing up against this, and it's like this. But she really broke it down, and it wasn't mysterious. It wasn't this mythical thing. And it's again, this trend of trying to fragment female bodies into these disparate organs, disparate experiences. And I think that seeing it as something more unified and like whole is really helpful and empowering for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. It's like that old story about the men exploring like different parts of the elephant and thinking it's like a separate like weird creature, instead of seeing like the whole thing, like different parts of the flying penguin creature.
Exactly.
So, we've talked a bit about how our social preconceptions and like cultural values hinder our progress in understanding these organs and body parts. But I think you also do a great job of showing how like shame and like this like stereotype of like these organs being gross, like how that has really contributed to the hindrance of medical progress. Like I just think of like a couple of examples. Like you talk about Linda Griffith, who is a tissue engineer pioneer, but you know, who never thought about applying her own work to endometriosis, which, you know, her problem. And you talked about that ick factor, stopping people from running like clinical trials of like to address bacterial vaginosis. And can you say more about like that dynamic?
Yeah, those are both great examples. That was really striking to me, that part of the reason I got into this book was the vaginal microbiome, because that experience that I had made me realize that there is this teeming ecosystem of bacteria that like keep like your vagina in balance, and your vagina is really as kind of portal between you and not you and the rest of the world. And we're just now finally defining what makes up that ecosystem and possibly how to shift it for some people. So I was like, this is awesome. Like, people must be super into this. Like the gut microbiome was so big. And then I started talking to the researchers that are trying to do this work, and they were all like, well, when we talk to like startups and funders, they all kind of back away. Nobody really cares about female sexual health. Like nobody sees why it's a problem. It doesn't kill you. And like many of these like venture capitalists are men and do not react well when you start talking about vaginal bacteria. So I like, this was affecting the scientific process at every step of the way, starting with funding, what gets resourced, and so what trials can take off. And there were many hurdles to the science, but that was really a big one. So the way it was described to me by sexual health experts was with fecal transplants, which you know a lot about, there was already a hurdle of gross poop. But we had like a deadly disease that could potentially be cured and like great results, and that overrode the ick factor. And then with something like vaginal microbiome transplants to solve in transient infections, you have two hurdles. It gets gross vaginas, and oh, it doesn't kill you though. So it's not considered important, and it's considered gross. And I think those two forces together really combine to stymie this research, especially, and slow it down. Even though it's like a really exciting frontier. And like, there's just so many issues that are both reproductive and sexual health issues that have no good solutions, as like I found out personally. And this is one way of addressing them. And yet it's so hard to get it off the ground.
It's just sort of baffling when you really think about it. Like the idea that in the like ick factor hierarchy, vaginas for some reason ranks higher than poop. Like I'm pretty sure only one of those things is something that a lot of people spend a lot of time trying to get very close to. Right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. How did that come about? Let me count the ways. I mean, I'll just mention that something I ended up writing more about after I finished the book was that the one medical term for the vulva, the outer female genitalia, that shows up in every gynecology book that I was looking in as pudendum, and it means the parts for which you should be ashamed in Latin. And like, there's a lot more nuance in that. Like that used to be a word that applied to men, but at some point it just disappeared and it's only in the medical textbooks for women. But when I started looking into it, like I saw this pattern. It wasn't just this one word. It was every time the clitoris was discovered, it was named like the shame member. And you have words still in like German, you have Schamlippen, that's the labia, and it means the shame lips. So this is pervasive. There is something going on here that's not just like someone made a mistake or someone was a jerk. There's a pattern of associating shame with the female body, and shame creates silence and stigma and people not wanting to talk about it or work on it.
Yeah. So we're nearly to time for audience questions. I'm sure there are some. So I think like before we turn over, I think the last thing I wanted to ask you is, you're writing about how our knowledge of the female body is just so much shallower than it should be. And of course, like when we talk about the female body in that context, it's also your body in particular. Like, did writing the book change how you thought about yourself?
Yeah. In some ways, I think I was actually kind of using that kind of like radical empathy as I did this reporting that I think you use a lot, that like most like patients I talked to had experienced something I had no concept of. Like I haven't had a baby, I haven't had endometriosis. So I like, even though we might share the same body parts, I think I actually was kind of trying to traverse a vast gulf and like bridge that divide. But yeah, I definitely feel like I was really screwed over by sex ed in this country, by just the main message that I got was don't get pregnant, don't get STDs, and at some point you're going to start bleeding and it's going to be scary and it's going to hurt. And so there was always like these negative feelings. And now I just think about like my uterus shedding and like creating new cells every month, and like my ovaries pumping out hormones that are supporting me, and like all this amazing, wondrous stuff that my body's doing that I was totally unaware of, that's just on autopilot, to the point that like when something went wrong and like my microbiome got a little out of flux, like that was a crisis. But think of like the 98% of the time that ecosystem is thriving and protecting me and supporting my body. So I'm like really kind of proud and empowered by all that. And I don't like feel, I think I've heard this weird idea that like people want to get pregnant to see what their body can do, and because like it has that capability, which is like an incredible, unbelievable capability, but your body's doing awesome things all the time while you're just breathing. So I think about that more and feel like I'm like a Miss Frizzle in my own body.
That's amazing. I love that. All right. I could do this for hours more, but John, welcome back. What do our lovely attendees have to say?
Thank you, Ed. Thank you for such a wonderful conversation. We do have some questions from the audience. Robbie asks, it seems like a big theme of the book is that scientific knowledge is shaped by the culture in which that knowledge is produced. As a science writer, I am wondering if this insight has affected the way you approach stories since you have completed your book.
Hi, Robbie. Yeah, that's a great question. So I think I'm just much more attuned to asking scientists, I don't want to say personal questions, but like I always wanted to tell the story behind the science and get an idea of someone's like motivation, what brought them to it. But now I'm much more interested in what else they're bringing to the table, and if like assumptions kind of come up when we're talking. So trying to think of a good example of that. I mean, like sperm scientists I talked to in the book, like when they would say stuff like, "Oh my gosh, sperm are like these warheads, these like nuclear warheads that like think on their own, and they're just stripped down and they're just so cool." I would, instead of just being like, "Oh yeah, that makes sense," I would kind of question like where that comes from and what's shaping it, and like where are the kind of the gaps in knowledge. So yeah, I mean, I think I've kind of always approached my work as like scientists are people that are shaped by the culture they're in, that therefore bring that to their work. Like all my parents are scientists and they're very quirky people. So yeah, I don't know if that changed that much, but I'm definitely more attuned to it specifically in like the reproductive health world.
Rachel asks, how do you think people with this set of anatomy should begin to explore these organs with the knowledge provided in the book?
Yeah, like explore personally or like scientifically. I mean, I met some really cool young scientists who are beginning, like I'm not a scientist, but who were asking new questions that I think hadn't been asked. So they were like literally exploring these organs in a new way. And they had told me like I learned everything in the world to know about like beetle penises in my like biology classes, but I realized we don't know the composition of vaginal mucus. And so that's what they were looking at, and how it affects sperm, and like what are kind of the chemical components that lead sperm to the egg, without which like fertility can't happen. So yeah, I really hope that those that are science minded or in the sciences will start asking questions that like seem obvious but don't have good answers. Exploring these organs. I mean, there's like I could recommend quite a lot of great books to continue wanting to learn like the scientific and historical context, including like Inferior by Angela Sinai, or like looking up at my book list right now. I was going to say, Ask Me About My Uterus was a really, really moving book to me about a woman's search to understand her own endometriosis. And it's part like medical history and personal memoir. And it's just like incredible and heartbreaking. Bonk, Mary Roach is a classic romp that I think really does also get at this shame, how that has shaped the science, and that it's always been like scientists have to justify that it's not about sex. It's always got to be about reproduction, or just like looking straight at sex and the act of sex is just like not okay. And that's created, like that's really shaped the avenues in which the science has gone through. Yeah, those are a few thoughts.
Thank you. Justin writes, was it a challenge getting the book published given the stigma of talking about / studying this subject?
I had very interesting reactions. When I was talking to agents, even before that, I had one who told me he listened to the whole pitch. And he said, okay, well, men aren't going to read your book, but that's okay because only women buy books. So that was an interesting idea. Didn't go with him. But with the publishers, like there was a ton of interest, and it's really like ironic to me that this was a time, I think 4 years ago, when reproductive rights were like in the news for all the wrong ways, and there was going to be a really, really restrictive abortion law in Texas. And so this was really on people's minds. And I think some senator had said, like, well, can't you figure out where a pregnancy is at by putting like a little camera in their throat? And it's like, but that's not connected to your stomach. That won't, I mean, yeah, your vagina and your uterus and your stomach aren't connected. So I was like, people need a basic anatomy lesson, and like, we really need to understand this history more than ever. So they responded really well to that. Some publishing houses did literally say like, I love this, but I won't be able to convince my higher ups of it, or we just did a vagina book. So there were different biases than you might think, I guess, at play. And people had different ideas of where they wanted to go with it. Some wanted it to be more political and more directly about the current reproductive rights movement. And I think that's incredibly important. And there's really good books being written about that right now. But I realized that even the history, which you would think everyone had access to, was not told yet. And that was a really big gap as well. So yeah, I think we had some issues where like Instagram like censored when I used the word vagina and stuff. So I had to use like asterisks. It's been interesting.
Yeah, thank you. That's the end of our audience questions so far. If you have questions, we still have some time. Please feel free to submit them. But Ed, I have to admit that I want to hear more of your questions. So maybe
I've got more.
I want to hear about Ed's book.
I can keep going. We can do my book at the very, very end. I'll give you like 1 minute about it. But I think Rachel's on a roll, and I think we should.
You to that then.
We do have one more question here that just came in from Ali, who asks, in your opinion, what are the most interesting burgeoning scene areas for women's health?
Science areas, I think.
Science, or maybe science areas. Sorry, excuse me.
Yeah. Well, I did mention the vaginal microbiome, and I definitely see that endometriosis is having a moment. Like over the course of writing this book, it went from a thing that my editors hadn't heard of often to something that everyone's heard of and has kind of become a poster, not everyone, but in my circles, a poster child of an a misunderstood and little studied disease that deserves more recognition. And I think there's a hope that this can apply to all these other reproductive conditions, including like PCOS and fibroids, which are even lesser known. And I think it's worth mentioning that endometriosis is stereotyped as the career women's disease and a white woman's disease, whereas fibroids have been associated more with the Black community. And you can see which one has gotten more funding and attention and resources recently. But I think that like shining this light on endometriosis, like now there's more NIH funding, more dedicated centers, is showing us that it's a full body issue. It's inflammatory. It's about the immune system. It is not just your quote reproductive organs. And there are probably much better solutions than the only ones we have, which are cutting out the lesions or tamping down hormones. So again, treating it as like it's about like it's only hormonal and or only reproductive. And so this is how we approach it in that framework. And now as people like Linda Griffith are looking at immunity and inflammation blockers and how it responds to different factors, I think some real progress will finally be made, and hopefully that trickles down and ends up bringing to light these other diseases. I hope.
Thank you. Allie also writes, I would totally buy a Literati t-shirt featuring a fantastic clitodactyl creature. So
oh my gosh. Can you tell my publisher that? Because I've been trying to convince them that this is merch that we need. Actually, my idea was like it's the pre-chapter illustration for the clitoris. And I wanted tote bags that say, "The pleasure is all mine."
Oh, so good.
I'll put a poll out because they were like, I don't know, Rachel.
Rachel, where did you actually get the model from?
I actually 3D printed a bunch of them at MIT, but the data was not from me. It was from a French engineer who took it upon herself to like disseminate this. And I think, and they initially, I think, relied on Helen O'Connell's work. So it all came full circle. And now there are gynecologists that have these in their office and use them to show women like their anatomy and how much of it is unseen. But yeah, I got some fun looks from the MIT technicians there.
There is a question that just came in. Verity wants to know if this newer knowledge is impacting choices about hysterectomies.
That's something I'm really interested in pursuing, actually. So hysterectomies are like, it's well documented that they're incredibly overused. And one of the leading reasons for them is endometriosis. Fibroids are another. And so to me, it is still in this framework of like, this is a reproductive disease. The problem is the uterus, take it out and you'll fix it. And there's not a consideration of how much else this organ is doing, especially if the hysterectomy involves taking out the ovaries, which puts you into a very abrupt early menopause. So yeah, I do think that this newer understanding of how the uterus is functioning, not during pregnancy, and the hormonal importance of the ovaries is probably leading to more critique of hysterectomies as this like first resort solution, which I don't think it ever should have been. Because again, I think the idea is, okay, well, this woman's done having babies or she's not going to have babies. She doesn't need her uterus. It's just like an appendix, just take it out. And that's not true. Like, and again, these organs are all connected and the whole, like your whole anatomy changes if you remove something like that. So yeah, that's a great question.
Thank you. We are reaching the top of the hour. Rachel, I know that you want to ask Ed about his book, so I want to give you time to do that, despite Ed's protestations.
Okay. We did make a deal.
Ed, an immense world is such a beautiful act of empathy. So was there a chapter that gave you the most joy during the incredibly like dark and important reporting you've been doing these past 2 years?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, I think that in the chapter on vibrations, there's a whole sequence about these little insects called tree hoppers that send these messages along the surfaces of plants that they can feel and we can't hear unless we clip a little microphone onto the plant and translate those signals into audible sounds. And these are insects that I guarantee you will have sat next to if you've been in any kind of outdoor space, but you probably don't know they exist. Their vibrational songs, if you convert them into audio, sound like nothing you would expect an insect to make. They don't sound like a chirping cicada. They sound like a musical instrument or a bird singing, or, you know, they sound sometimes mechanical or like a monkey. They are beautiful and mesmerizing and completely unexpected. And there's something about thinking that the plants around us are just like horror-skating with hidden, beautiful songs that we can't perceive. It's just magical. I love stuff like that. Some of my favorite parts of the books are that when you learn amazing biology, but that also completely reconfigures your perception of the world around you, which, you know, like your book does too. I think there's like a common theme here about like defamiliarizing yourself with a lot of these things that you know, that you thought you knew, whether for reasons of like centuries of sexism, or whether it's to do with like the constraints of our own senses.
Yeah, making things strange and new and wonderful, the misfrizzling. I do,
Right.
yeah, I admire that in you, and I think that is a strain we're both fascinated by. And
Thank you. Yeah, like keep life, you know, keep science weird. I think like keep biology weird is
biology defamiliarized.
Right, yeah. And I think the funny thing is that like biology is so inherently weird, right? It almost doesn't need the help, our help, and yet like it kind of does, because for all these reasons that we've talked about, we do limit our understanding, and I think sometimes it takes like this deliberate nudge, like it takes the work of a good writer to open the door and like push people through it, to make that clear. And so I have, as agreed, talked about my book for one question, but I do want to finish by saying that I loved this book, Rachel. It's such a wonderful piece of work. It's so beautifully written. It's so constantly fascinating. I'm thrilled. I've listened to you talk about what you've learned and the process, and hope everyone listening either tonight or on YouTube later goes out and buys a copy. Get one for your friends and family too. Everyone should read it, and I guarantee you they'll enjoy it too.
Pair it with an immense world. And no, sorry. Yeah, thank you so much. That was like the best orchestrated conversation I've ever been in. Not one moment of awkward boredom or silence. Amazing.
Oh, well, the book deserves it. I think it's just full of wonder and delight all the way through. So thank you. Congratulations with everything, and I honestly cannot wait to see what you do next.
Thank you so much, Ed. Thank everyone for coming and joining us and exploring other worlds of wonder and delight. It makes me so happy that other people want to do this too. Thank you for this conversation.
Thank you both, Rachel E. Gross.
Hosting us, John.
Our pleasure. Ed Yong, thank you so much for joining us. You can purchase Vagina Obscura and an Anatomical Voyage. There's links in the chat. There's also links in the description below me on YouTube. And you can also pre-order An Immense World from us as well. That comes out on June 21st. Once again, Rachel E. Gross, Ed Yong, thank you so much for joining us at Home with Literati. I hope to have you both in the store in the not too distant future. But until then, we hope you continue to stay safe and be well. And to all of our viewers, we look forward to seeing you at the next event. Take care, all.
Thank you.